Spanish and Critique Towards a Feminist Analysis of Penality, published by Routledge in 1994, Sex, Violence and Crime, Foucault and the Man Question in 2008, and with Daniela Alaitinoglu, you edited the Contesting Femicide, Feminism and the Power of Law, Revisited it. So today you're going to talk us about a new book project and theatrical project as well. If I'm wrong, it's called Crimes of Passion Since Shakespeare. The floor is yours. We're looking forward to listening to your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming. That's the book. I want to start in what might seem like an unlikely place, and that is Yvette Cooper saying last week at the Labour conference that Labour will set up Young Futures youth program to tackle knife crime, and she wants to address some of the underlying causes of that behind the recent stabbings. And in the process of the talk, she mentioned the case of the 15-year-old girl, Eliane Andam in Croydon. You might have seen this. I mean, you've heard about that case, I presume. And this was some of the newspaper reports, the initial reports. Machete revenge, girl 15 killed for dumping boy, stabbed for refusing roses. Then the early reports were that the witnesses said that there was some argument about having a boy having been dumped the previous day. And so the media came out with, "Are we losing the fight against crime?" You know, she's the 15th teen to die in London this year. It's a national crisis, and she's the 15th to die. She's the first girl, by the way. What happened next is we found out it wasn't actually a machete in the latest reports, and the victim was not the dumping girl. The victim was her friend. But it still seems to, the witnesses, as we know, I mean, this is sub judice, but we still seem to think that the witnesses are saying there were roses involved and a long knife and a breakup. So these still feature in the story about what happened. And the head of Metropolitan Police called it a senseless murder, which is impossible to comprehend. First of all, it's not a murder. It's not a murder until it's been called a murder in the court. He may have a defence, for example. But leaving that aside, is it impossible to comprehend? Not at all, from my perspective. In my view, it shouldn't be classified as knife crime. It should be classified as yet another intimate partner femicide. Of a woman leaving a relationship, or a young woman, committed by a male exploding in homicidal rage and anger at being rejected. And so this way that Yvette Cooper and all the media outlets represent this case, they subsume it into knife crime, and I want to call that a category error. So writing this book and working in the field of fighting femicide, you come across a lot of category errors, disavowals and denials that this is the reality of the situation of impassioned homicide, that it is, the sex-based symmetry is astonishing. It's like, of impassioned homicides, 90-95% are committed by males against women. The book is a contribution to the campaign against intimate partner femicide, and to get it recognised as a first-order political problem. And it pays homage to the early 21st century English campaign to abolish the provocation defence. So you people are lawyers, you're not lawyers, are you? So the provocation defence has been abolished in England now. And what it used to do was reduce murder to manslaughter if you had a partial defence to say that the victim provoked you to attack her. And that's been abolished on the ground that it was letting men get away with murder. So this is my new framing that I've worked out since this knife crime issues came up, is that you could read the campaign to abolish provocation as a rejection of another category error. And that category error that we've had for centuries was that killing a departing girl or woman who says nasty things on the way out is manslaughter, not murder. That is, I think we see that as a category error, then in fact it should be seen as murder. So Maddie Humes in 2001, this is the famous relatively recent Red Mist case. She was stabbed to death by her husband in front of their 4 children. But it didn't go to court because he pleaded guilty to manslaughter by provocation, saying that he was in a red mist at the time because he thought she was having an affair. He did a deal with the Crown Prosecution Service and got a 7-year sentence. That caused a lot of outrage at the time, and the Attorney General, Howe, as it happened, appealed on the ground of undue leniency, but the appeal failed. And that set her off on this law reform movement. So it's the Matty Humes case which precipitated this movement to abolish this offence. And on the very specific ground that it had let men get away with murdering wives for a century. So it wasn't abolished on the ground that it was knife crime, even though he knifed her to death. Knives, in fact, have been the weapons of choice in the hundreds of cases that I studied for this book over 400 years since Shakespeare. That they would be the predominant weapon of choice for men killing women. And so what I'm arguing here is that calling them knife crimes, calling that 15-year-old girl's death in Croydon a knife crime, is as delusionary as registering all these other cases of intimate partner femicide as knife crimes. Okay, what was fascinating about Harman's law reform movement, which has been highly successful, by the way, is that she called this provocation defence our own version of honour killing. Our own version of honour killing. It's just such a brilliant statement. And she went on to say, we're going to outlaw it. We've had the discussion, we've had the debate, and we've decided we're not going to bow to judicial protests. When we've changed the laws, we're confident the judiciary will implement it. I'm determined that women should understand we won't brook any excuses for domestic violence. So what I argue in the book is that this movement that she led not only revolutionised the law of murder by getting rid of the best defence possible for men killing women, it also challenged the entire conceit or concept of impassioned or red mist homicide. It actually challenged the whole idea of crime of passion. It actually challenged the whole idea of distinguishing between red-blooded or red-hot and cold-blooded murder, and saying basically it's the same and both are murder. It has been successful, as I said, but it was a massive fight to get it through Parliament. There was a massive resistance, especially in the House of Lords, at abolishing this defence that had been so useful for men for so many centuries. And the first case, even though she thought the judiciary would be really on side, the famous Clinton case in 2012, the Court of Appeal did its best to bring back infidelity as an excuse for murder. By the way, when she abolished the provocation defence, they replaced it with a loss of control defence, which sounds like the same thing. But the important bit was that it expressly excluded sexual infidelity as a trigger for loss of control. Now, I didn't think that reform would work. I'm against any kind of provocation. I'm a provocation abolitionist. But in fact, it has worked. Getting rid of that sexual infidelity excuse has meant that now men are overwhelmingly being convicted of murder. And that was the headline about the Clinton case in one of the London newspapers, crimes of passion defence restored in murder cases, but not for long. That was the last hurrah. So rereading my book, this is the first paper I've given since it got published in May, reminded me of the trauma of writing about those. I had actually had no idea how many cases there were over the centuries. So I'd only researched cases since the late 20th century. I had no idea how many cases there were over the centuries and how many to include in the book, how many to exclude, how to do justice to as many victims as possible, how to build up a critical mass of victims to counter offender-centric stories. But what was a relief writing it was reading the Shakespeare scholarship and looking at Shakespeare and bringing him into conversation with legal historian Jeremy Horder, who's written about provocation defence. So you might think I might start with Othello, and actually I started with his revenge play Titus Andronicus, because what's fascinating about this play, read from a post-humanist perspective, is that it critiques the way we venerate hallowed authorities, for example, Roman authorities for femicide. Titus Andronicus, the protagonist, searches for a reason, mighty and strong and effectual, patent precedent and lively warrant to kill his daughter who's been raped. And so you can read this play as a scathing indictment of looking for reasons, looking for excuses, looking for justifications for killing in the past, of authorising precedents. It's a critique, if you like, of justification by a precedent, which has a lot of relevance, by the way, to world affairs today. And what's interesting about the play, it was written in the late 16th century when there was this convergence of cultural and legal developments which laid the foundations of the English version of crime passionnel, or impassioned crime. Porter says that jurists were devising the legal rule then, at the same time that Shakespeare's writing this play, that cold-blooded murder could be distinguished from hot-blooded manslaughter. And at the same time, honour theorists were reviving the Aristotelian notion that angry retaliation in men of honour is honourable, not dishonourable. And these ideas informed the legal fiction that killing an adulterous wife befits a man of honour. Chapter 2 hacks Othello, which I read as a brilliant dissection of the notion of a crime of passion. I think it is the most brilliant in all of English literature. I read it as a Foucauldian problematisation of the idea of sexual infidelity as an excuse for killing a woman. It's got so much in it. It's got the racialisation of the impassioned killer as a monstrous other, othering. It's got Othello's self-aggrandisement as a man of honour. And he says, I'm an honourable murderer, if you will, but not I didn't hate, but all in honour. He's the man for ocular proof of his wife in Fragante. He can't get the proof because she wasn't, but he settles for obsessing over the missing handkerchief. And in doing so, he foreshadows 400 years of obsessive English infidelity cases. This play also looks at the specificity of male obsessiveness about sexual infidelity, which is built on ownership of women. O curse of marriage, that we call these delicate creatures ours and not their appetites. He also here foreshadows a brilliant Marxist reading of the play as dramatising commodity fetishism and early modern capitalism, revealing that slippage from love to loathing which gets narrated in these crimes of passion as scenarios of dispossessed love, like the roses in Croydon. And it also prefigures the feminist critique of the provocation by infidelity script, spoken by his proto-feminist character Amelia. These men are so obsessed with adultery, she said. It's such a small vice. Would she do such a thing for all the world? She would. Also in the book, chapter 3, I try to provide a counterpoint to offender-centric historians that, by lamenting the fate of femicidal men, many of whom before the 1960s were hanged in England, reinforce laws constructed provocative women propelling men to kill them. It's really tricky work trying to unpack this discursive reduction of victims to blameworthy whats without losing sight of them. So it was always going through the records trying to find the names of the victims, which were often not named. They're just sort of drummed out of history, but without losing sight of what the law courts are saying about the victim and the offender. So this is what I was trying to do, build up this critical mass of slaughtered women in order to constitute them as a killing field that's far larger than state-sanctioned executions. Offender-centric historians are obsessed with the killing of the men. They're opposed to capital punishment and they're worried about the fate of the men. But in fact, if you look at the actual numbers of women being killed, that's a far larger killing field than the number of men that were hanged. But there's pitfalls in making this kind of emphasis on the victims. You can get seen as someone who's for capital punishment, which I'm not, been condemned as, say, a carceral feminist. So I've actually got a line in the book that I'm opposed to the execution of men who execute women, just to make my position clear. Othello also, I think, uncannily presages the two defences that have been used by men who kill women over the centuries. The first is provocation. Methinks she has an eye to parley, to provocation, that is. Passion having my best judgment, collier to say, is to lead the way. Passion overwhelms his reason. And there's that self-serving final speech, which is this sort of a dream run for a defence lawyer of an exculpatory script. When you show these unlucky deeds, like killing his wife is unlucky, nothing. Speak of me as I am, nothing extenuates. You know, but then he goes on to extenuate. The other defence is diminished responsibility, where he falls down fitting, maybe having an epileptic fit, Othello, and he greets the governor Lodovico with, "Welcome, sir, to Cyprus, goats and monkeys." Like, what happened? What did I do?
Yeah, if you click, yeah, that one will probably bring it. Yeah, there we are.
And why isn't it going? There we go. So then I followed Passion's convoluted path through the cases as mitigating a crime or not. That's the foundational 1707. This is the famous case, which is all based on the great precedent, the lively warrant, if you like, setting down the rules that are generally agreed, at least in the early 18th century, but still today in many quarters. The most important is from Leviticus, the Bible, 2010. When a man is taken in adultery with another man's wife, if the husband shall stab the adulterer or knock out his brains, this is barely manslaughter, for jealousy is the rage of a man, and adultery the highest invasion of property. In my play, which I've written about putting Othello on trial for murder, that's to a rap song. When a man is taken, and so what I do is trace through the way passion is brought up in the case law, and as it's tried to, as the defence lawyers try to argue for it being a lesser form of homicide than murder. And I've traced the way it talks about heat of passion in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then it started to talk about fits of passion, which is more along the diminished responsibility line. I take on Martin Weiner's book, Men of Blood, Manliness and the Criminal Justice System in Victorian England. This is a classic offender-centric book. It's a history of the Victorian response to what he calls men of blood, who turn out to be nearly all wife killers. He's got 2 chapters titled Bad Wives, without inverted commas, because you need 2 chapters here, because you've got your drunken wives, but you've also got your unfaithful ones, so it takes 2 chapters. And he refers to them all throughout his book, and doesn't name any of them, by the way, as put upon, as they all annoy put upon men. So he's firmly in their camp. So, and he's openly sympathetic to the wife killers, especially those convicted of capital murder. So I'm trying to write the book tries to write a counter history to that offender-centric perspective, trying to insert their voices into the courtroom discourse and discussion about what should constitute murder. I just refer, the book is dedicated to the memory of Hannah Abbott, who nearly died in 1828 in London when her husband just missed her carotid nerve. He hanged because attempted murder had become a capital crime about about 10 years earlier. This caused outrage, but people think he shouldn't have been hung at all. And the offender-centric histories are just outraged and accept as fact all the affidavits and petitions in his favour trying to get him a reprieve from the death sentence. They accept the character assassination of the victim. Yet, if you go into the case and read it carefully, when you see Hannah being cross-examined in court, she was extraordinary. She's a charwoman, a literate charwoman, who incredibly impoverished, but she was just astonishing in court. And she was being pressed by the defence lawyer. Was her husband weak in mind? He's going for the sort of diminished responsibility defence here. No, she says he wasn't. Wasn't he very much given to jealousy? No, he only pretended so. He was just evil. He said he imputed you were unfaithful. No, she said. There was clear proof that this was quite false. Pressed again. Was he weak? No. But didn't she realise, he said, don't you realise his life's at stake now? And then she came out with an extraordinary statement. My life was at stake as well as his. I never considered my life safe with him. I don't want him executed. It's my wish to save his life, but my own as well. I needed Hannah on my side as I went through all those cases, reminding me that I didn't want him executed, or any of them executed. Throughout the 19th century, judges were absolutely against the idea that being impassioned should mitigate murder. They were absolutely trying to hold the line. You had to find the wife in the act, which they never did, by the way. And so the convictions for men rained down. Wife killers were a third to half of all the men killed in England at that time, and Wales. Holmes was the last hurrah for the judges, the 1946 case, and this is referring to Othello. He said he rejected the appeal of Holmes, who'd been convicted of murdering his wife, and he said even if Iago's insinuations had been against Desdemona had been true, Othello was guilty of murder and nothing else. But that was the last hurrah, really, for the judges trying to hold back, be really strict about what constitutes murder. With the Homicide Act 1957, we had a whole new revolution in the law of murder. It's famous for abolishing the death penalty, but it should be just as famous for adding diminished responsibility as a defence and widening provocation to anything done or said by the victim. So this is the beginning of the basis of what's called today the nagging and shagging defence in England. Because the men could just get up and say, she nagged me, she said this, she did that, and then the court goes, oh my God, that's horrendous, that's manslaughter, very low, that's not murder. And what they do often, and this is a whole, since 57, right through to the end of the 20th century, mixed and matched these defences, like he quite reasonably killed his garrulous, possibly unfaithful wife, but he was mentally impaired or depressed by her conduct. So they put them both together. Any man would be upset objectively by a wife that did this, but also he was impaired by it, so they put them both together. So by the end of the 20th century, what you had was men getting non-custodial sentences, judges saying she would have tried the patience of a saint, or very low short sentences for manslaughter. For example, one man was upset that his wife had left him and married someone else, so he killed their 3 daughters aged between 5 and 10, and he got manslaughter like 3 to 5 years because he was upset she'd left him. So these sorts of cases were starting to bring about disquiet, certainly by the families of the victims and also by the feminists wanting to get the law reform happening. And so this was when, in Australia, we were the first jurisdiction. Yep, what?
Like 5 years, yeah.
That's fine. We were the first jurisdiction in the world to abolish, Tasmania, to abolish provocation, and then England came along, and that's the act which abolished it, and abolished the idea of sexual infidelity as an excuse for murder. It's been a law with intended consequences. These men are now, starting from the late 20th century non-custodial sentences, they're now getting overwhelmingly convicted of murder and minimal sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. So it has been what they wanted. They would stop them getting away with murder. To take the final post-reform cases, as it happens in the book that I looked at, they were in 2021 and decided in 2022. You could call them knife crimes as you like, because all 3 of them were men killing women with knives. In the first one, the husband stabbed her 18 times. He used a loss of control defence, but he can't say sexual infidelity anymore because that's been excluded. So he gets convicted of murder and gets that 22-year sentence. The next one stabbed a woman in the heart. He thought she'd been cheating him, but what he does is he can't plead that anymore. Cheating's no longer a defence, so he pleads guilty to murder. So that's what's happening in a lot of cases. They're pleading out because they haven't got a defence anymore. Life with 25. Last one, another one stabs his woman, pleading guilty to murder, gets 18 years because he complained that she'd posted a TikTok video of herself with a new partner, but apparently today that's no longer a warrant for murder. You can do it. So, my conclusion. Can I just read the conclusion because it's easier? This is my conclusion about this law reform movement. The evidence is overwhelming that the reforms are having their intended effects. Men, or most of them, are no longer getting away with murdering their women. Accordingly, those reformers, led by Harriet Harman, are to be credited with a hard-fought victory. Owning impassioned femicide as the English version of honour killing, refusing to land at the door of supposedly emotionally incontinent foreigners or minorities, they have held the English law of murder to account in the face of near hysterical opposition from a legal fraternity bent on defending the status quo. What an achievement, exposing English law's hallowed provocation defence for so long proclaimed as a noble concession to human frailty, as nothing more than the fetishising, property-obsessed excuse for murdering women that Shakespeare dismantled and dissected so brilliantly in Othello 400 years ago. Okay, it's been an amazing success in the courts, but of course that notion that women who upset men deserve to die is still with us. Look at the Croydon, as far as we know, it's still a question of roses or the knife. Accept my roses or you get the knife. And the last word I'll give to Shakespeare. He wrote this in a different context. This is really what I'm trying to say about the provocation excuse, I think. Oftentimes the excusing of a fault doth make the fault the worser by the excuse. That's it.
For Q&A, we have the video. Yeah.
I've just got a 4.5 minute film clip which tries to show how I'm trying to reach. Sometimes I get sick of academic audiences, no offence, and I try to get these ideas out to a broader public. I mean, a lot of people, even in the law field, don't know about these reforms. They don't know that this has happened in England and Wales. And so I've written a play to try to get it out to young people. It's for young people, and it's been performed in London and Melbourne with young people as young as 13. And they get to participate, they get to be the jury to determine whether Othello is guilty of murder or manslaughter. So this little 4.5 minute film talks about the way I'm trying to get the academic research out into with a public engagement project into a wider public.
The Othello Theatre and Education Action Research Project invites you to join the global movement of feminist activists and researchers fighting intimate partner femicide. Its aim is to transform women's grievable lives into sustainable ones, lives that outlive men's possessive rage. Preceding the Me Too movement by decades, this movement tests the political and cultural climate for elevating intimate partner femicide or wife killing into a first-order political problem. How? By actioning feminist legal research on femicide cases in political forums. A key target has been the provocation defence, which reduces murder to manslaughter in Anglophone jurisdictions. For centuries, it has allowed men to get away with murdering women by saying she provoked me to kill her. She was unfaithful, nagged, left me, so she asked for it. I was in a red mist. As a leading feminist English law reformer put it, the provocation defence allows men to escape murder charges by blaming the victim. Abolishing it is an important law change to end the culture of excuses. Sparked by outrage over short sentences for wife killers, the English reform movement succeeded, despite massive opposition from senior judges. Provocation has now been abolished in England and Wales. It has also been abolished in Tasmania, Victoria, West Australia and South Australia, where it is now difficult for men to get away with murdering women. But not in non-abolitionist states like New South Wales, where Othello syndrome was recently accepted, and not in Queensland, where in a recent case, knifing a woman 29 times, then hitting her over the head with a concrete bollard was found to be manslaughter, not murder. What's at stake here? Women's lives. We need more strategies to challenge victim-blaming cultural scripts. Here's one, a public engagement theatre and education project that dramatises legal action research on femicide cases. Othello, Shakespeare's famous play featuring a man who kills his wife, Desdemona, suspecting her of infidelity, is the perfect vehicle for challenging the time-honoured idea of a mitigating impassioned femicide. Othello on Trial, or The Tragedy of Desdemona the Wife, puts Othello on trial for murder, and provides a platform for young people to express their views about excuses for killing women. There's a judge, a prosecutor, a defence lawyer, and the defendant. The target audience of secondary students is the jury. Will they accept his defences, loss of control or mental illness, or will they convict him of murder? It's set at the Old Bailey and focuses on English law and cases. Why not Australia? Too close to home. The defendant is a white man. Why? To problematise racial othering, to show that Black Othello was a white man's highly racialised idea of a black man, to highlight that white Englishmen have been killing their wives for centuries. To agree with French philosopher Michel Foucault that what matters is not who is speaking or killing, but how the killer and the victim are put into discourse. What he said, she said, or did to upset him is the heart of the matter. Target legal and culturally inscribed excuses for hurting women, not the pathetic individual killers endlessly repeating the hackneyed phrase, "if I can't have her." This theatre project strives to engage young people with the enormous task of transforming women's grievable lives into sustainable ones. Join this activating theatre space as performers, engage audiences and educators. Help us reach young people before they get acclimatised into thinking that women ask for it.
Except you're not getting a performance. Maybe next year.
Right, thank you very much for this. It's a grim presentation, but it's reality. So if you have any questions, please feel free. We have plenty of time. How much time do we have? About 15 minutes?
15 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
I'll go first. Thank you very much, Adrian, for that. And I know nothing about this subject, so I'm just sitting here with my mouth open at what I'm learning today. And congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you.
As well, by the way.
It's got nominated for a prize.
Sorry?
It's got
The
nominated for a
SLSA prize. Yeah.
So I have two questions. The first one might be just because of my naivety. I've got no idea. I was rather taken aback when you said, the House of Lords and the judges were pushing back. I don't know, what was the reason for this? I mean, other than these being, old white men, what possible justification is there for pushing back on this? And the other thing is, I know you mentioned in there, Australia, but I wondered what other areas, are England looking at other areas of this? I'm thinking in particular, I've got some experience with Mexico, where, femicide is a huge issue as well. So I just wondered, is there any kind of looking beyond the Anglo, Anglosphere?
Yes. Oh, thank you. The first one, sorry, yes. They defended it on the ground that it's a time-honoured excuse. It goes back to Leviticus. It goes, it's still there today in 2023 in Croydon. I mean, it's the idea that you've left me, so I'm going to kill you. You either take my roses or I've got my knife behind her. I mean, it's such a strong but House of Lords, yes, they did reject it on the first reading. But my favourite is Lord Neil. He was a retired judge in the House of Lords. Can I just read what he said? Because I use his speech. That becomes the defence lawyer's final argument in my play, because it's. This is what he says about it and what he got up and say. The most common thing he said that one reads, keep in mind he's a retired judge, right? So he's been in a courtroom. Anyway, the most common thing to read in the press in murder cases is that the wife or husband finds the other spouse in the sexual act, loses control, picks up a bread knife or whatever comes to hand and stabs someone and kills the other spouse, the wife or husband. That is French-style crime passionnel. Are we now turning it into something the English, with their stiff upper lip, will take as an ordinary incident of marital life? That is ridiculous and out of line with the way in which most people think about human passions. And then he said, later he admitted that it was mainly men killing women. Antigone, he recalled, was an exception, proving the rule that on the whole it was men. Missing the fact that Antigone actually didn't kill anyone, but leaving that aside, he goes, we would make ourselves look extraordinarily foolish if we say a jury cannot take account of what most people recognise as being the dominant cause of violence by one individual against another. And this is my favourite bit. Every opera you go to, every novel you read has sexual infidelity at some point or otherwise. Otherwise, it's not worth reading or listening to. That was his case for keeping the provocation defence. Anyway, it just blows my mind. Okay, yes, there's been femicide, anti-femicide movements around the world. Italy particularly has a strong one. They only have a slightly higher, it's 2 a week. Women get killed has been the figure in mainstream media even for the last 20, 30 years. And Italy's slightly higher, but there's been a very big movement there. Not in Germany or France, as I can see. Mexico, yes, because, as you said, it's a huge problem there. Feminicidio, has a big movement there to get rid of the whole notion of impassioned crime. Yeah. Just on that note, though, sometimes people ask me, has it gone down, the numbers? Under lockdowns, as we all know probably, in Australia and England, the domestic violence went up, but the femicides actually went down in both countries. Why would that be, do you think?
Because I couldn't blame anybody for having an affair because there's an opportunity to.
Well, why not? Because, yeah.
They're in the same house.
They couldn't get out. You couldn't leave. Now, that's right. The main reason, and this today and in the past, I didn't realise until I did all those studies in the 19th century cases, the main reason men are killing women is because they leave or want to leave. And under lockdown, they couldn't, so they weren't being killed. Yeah. Well done. So it's not a good thing to be laugh about.
Nick?
Yes, we have a question from MS Teams. So this is from Katie, who is a lawyer. What are your thoughts on the lawmakers' idea that by removing the requirement of a sudden snap, the loss of control defence would be more accessible to female defendants than the previous provocation?
What is this? I'm trying to remember the coroners. I don't write about women killing men cases. I have been involved in a couple in Australia as a lawyer, but the Coroners and Justice Act also excluded something that made it history of violence could also. Is that right? I can't even remember now. There's some reason for that. Anyway, leaving that aside. As far as I'm concerned, if anyone kills another person, except in a situation of self-defense, it's murder. I think the cases of women killing men, male partners, are extremely difficult. They're usually really complicated fact stories. But even with a history, like the famous one that got out, I've forgotten the name now, a few years ago, they got her out after 9. She was convicted of murder. Her husband was abusive, I think, and also had lots of affairs and went to brothels. And so she banged him on the head with a hammer at lunch, as you do. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's murder. I don't care how violent well, I care, of course, but that is not the answer. It's not the answer in Gaza either. Unless there is clear evidence of self-defense, I think they should be convicted of murder. I don't mind. I don't have a problem with the woman in those circumstances being deprived of defence. Would be my answer to that.
Yeah, and of course, a big emphasis that you've made throughout is that it's because the proportions of people involved in spousal homicide are so skewed towards men.
Well, there's that, but also, we've got, this goes for anyone, but it just happens to be that it's men that kill women. Mm-hmm. Right? But if a woman kills a man over infidelity, the same thing. I don't think she should have a defence.
Any other questions?
It's just an interesting point, really, about the way men see women as possessions, and I suppose as possessions. And so if you leave me, you get punished for leaving me because you belong to me. And it's the same thing about blaming rape victims as well. They're provoked. Men are provoked into raping because of how
the short dress.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So it's victim blaming. You nagged me. You've worn a short skirt, and therefore I'm going to kind of attack you.
So did you want to say something?
I was having the same thought when throughout a lot of your talk I kept on thinking about the kinds of excuses that you hear for men raping women as well as killing them. We hear the same kinds of things in that she was asking for it, she deserved it, she did this, she did that, she did the other. And also we seem to get an awful lot of things, especially in the press and media, about things that women can do to protect themselves from attack, from rape and so on. And it's always the emphasis is put back on women to, you know, not drink too much when they go out with their friends, or to, you know, not walk home alone at night and all that kind of thing. And it always seems to come back to this idea that men are incapable of controlling themselves. And I think that that does a disservice to both women, obviously, as you know, by blaming them for men's failure to control themselves, and also actually it does a bit of a disservice to men, because it kind of suggests that men are simply incapable of controlling their own emotions and all of that. And I don't think that that's simply, I just don't think that that's true. I think that men are more than capable of controlling themselves. They choose not to in those situations. And then because historically they've gotten away with it, whether it be, you know, spousal murder or rape or whatever, they assume that they will get away with it because so many people before them have. Do you think along those same lines? I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why this reform was so extraordinary. Harman just said no. We're not doing this anymore. And she fought it right through the House of Parliament. Took years, few years, and it's working. I mean, these guys are now women are still being killed, but they're not being character assassinated in the courts. It's absolutely essential, because every time a man gets away with killing a woman, if there's no self-defense, with manslaughter, it reduces her. It reduces her to an unworthy victim, basically, that she's asked for it. You know, it's kind of, you know, the whole nagging and shagging. The whole idea of being called a nagging and shagging offence was also sex specific. You wouldn't say that about a man. Men don't nag. That's why I just think it, and to push this movement through on the ground that it was men were getting away with murder, she just named it for what it was. And to call it our own version of honour killing, saying, stop this othering, stop saying this about these minorities, look at all these white men. They are overwhelmingly white men, by the way, over the centuries, overwhelming. There was only one black man I remember in the whole cases back then, and even today, black men are underestimated. I don't like to talk about the offenders because then it gets back on them, but I can tell you that they're underrepresented. They're mainly white men. And the Othello scenario of killing a wife and then killing themselves, murder-suicides, are 95%. 95% in all Anglophone jurisdictions, white men. So that the way that Harman presented that, you know, as our own version of honour killing, this is how men have got away with saying it's their honour over the centuries. It was just extraordinary statement, and she deserves a huge report for that. I've given her a copy of my book. I'm trying to get a little event going because she's retiring from Parliament next year, and I'm trying to get a copy of my book. Some sort of presentation going to honour that reform movement. Yeah. As for sexual assault, I can't do it. It's too hard. Murder cases are easier because they're intentional killings. They all none of these. So what they're saying now, the guys are saying, oh, it was an accident. You know, the knife in her back or the axe through her head was an accident. That doesn't work. It's not washing. That's why they're pleading guilty to murder. They haven't got an excuse anymore. Accident. Sometimes they try to say self-defense. That doesn't work either. You know, she's got this tiny little knife and he's got this whatever going on. But sexual assault is too hard because they just say she consented. You know the figures on that. It's 95% don't get prosecuted by the time it goes through. It's just so difficult.
Right. Well, I also have a question. Is there anything problematic with the distinction not between murder and manslaughter, but premeditated, cold-blooded versus hot-blooded murder? Is there which exists regardless of the victim? But is there anything problematic in the case of femicides if this distinction is invoked?
But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
This reform was about abolishing the distinction.
Yeah.
From a victim's point of view, it doesn't matter whether it was a hot-blooded or cold-blooded, they're still dead.
Mm-hmm.
The distinction is problematic. It's a category error again.
But is it across all crimes, only femicide, that the one that this distinction has to be
I'm opposed
abolished?
to the idea of provoked killings in any event.
Across.
Yeah.
In different cases as well.
Yeah. In any sense.
It can be a parent angry or somebody angry about. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one case that came up in the late 20th century was a baby. The baby was crying, so he killed the baby, and he got away with manslaughter because it was upsetting him. The whole notion of provocation in any context I find problematic. International affairs, wars, Ukraine, provoked, Gaza is provoked, so I'm going to, it's a really problematic concept.
So I'm wondering. You said that manslaughter would be appropriate for self-defense. That would be like one strict sense in which it would be, and it was like credible.
Self-defense is a whole defense.
Oh, that would be a whole. Oh, so you wouldn't have it at all.
Defending yourself
So
if you haven't committed a crime.
are there any conditions under which manslaughter would be an appropriate?
Would be appropriate, yeah.
Yeah, it would be
dangerous driving. You've got other forms of manslaughter.
Yeah.
David, those kind of, unintentional killings. These are intentional killings. They intended to kill, but they have some partial excuse. Like the victim asked for it, or I was upset, or I was mentally upset. It's interesting. Some of the cases, some of these guys have actually got diagnosed schizophrenic illnesses or mental illness, and the jury still comes out and says murder, because he might have a mental illness, but he's still got some sense of responsibility. He does still know what he's doing. So today, even they're not even accepting the diminished responsibility defence. It's just kind of amazing how it's just transformed it from men getting non-custodial sentences before this reform to now getting these murder convictions. I find it incredible. I didn't think it was going to work. I didn't think getting rid of sexual infidelity would do it. I thought you'd have to get rid of provocation altogether, but it's working. They just haven't got an excuse, mainly. I mean, there's still some outliers, but mainly this is working. Yeah. I mean, provocation is still a sentencing discretion. So the guy gets convicted of murder, but then the judge can still say, oh, well, she was a bit of a cow, so take off a couple of years at the sentencing level. But at least it's not a defence anymore. The victims' families want a murder conviction.
Right, well, thank you for your very important presentation, and thank you for coming here.
Thanks very much. Brilliant. Thank you for everyone who logged in from elsewhere, and for those who are here, I think Adrian has time for maybe one drink or so before she gets her train. So we might be have a little meeting afterwards. But thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.
I'm going to teach you how to
Oh yes, of course.
I'm going to get the USB, wherever it is.
Oh yes, sorry.
I see it.
try to see you in an hour.
I'm off duty for a day now.